guys, what's up to another episode of the Goodcast Show. So there's 4 of them out there, and today I got the second Alatas on my podcast, so I have my sights on the remaining 2. My guest today, he's a professor of Sociology and Anthropology who's been teaching at the National University of Singapore since 1992, and he was also head of the Department of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Malaya prior to that. Now, his intellectual legacy resides within a large number of books, articles, chapters and reports and reviews, op-eds that he has authored over the years. Some of his books and work that you might know is Democracy and Authoritarianism in Indonesia and Malaysia, The Rise of the Post-Colonial State in 1997, Alternative Discourses in Asian Social Science, Responses to Eurocentrism, 2006, and Applying Ibn Khaldun, The Recovery of a Lost Tradition in Sociology. Today's topic of discussion will be, of course, multiculturalism in Malaysia. Now, my guest today is widely celebrated as a pivotal figure in the increasing popular discussions about decolonizing universities. We'll definitely get into more into what that exactly means. He has sent shockwaves through academia and academic disciplines in recent years, prompting uncomfortable examinations of the role that universities have played and continue to play in furthering colonial legacies such as Eurocentrism and racism. This I do agree with 100%. Ladies and gentlemen, he's none other than Professor Dr. Syed Farid Alatas. How are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you, Vinod.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Now, when I was watching your previous speeches, your keynote speeches and interviews, you used this word, decolonizing universities. What do you mean by that?
Well, to put it simply, our universities are products of the colonial period.
Yeah.
And the universities during the colonial period were set up to continue the interests or to promote the interests of the colonial state, of the colonial regime. So the kind of knowledge that was produced in the colonial universities was informed by colonial biases, colonial attitudes, colonial programs, especially in the social sciences and humanities. They reflect a colonial bias, or what is the same thing, a Eurocentric bias. Now, the interesting thing is, after independence, most universities in the former colonized world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, continue to teach, especially in the social sciences and humanities, through this colonial or Eurocentric bias. So we can say there's still coloniality in our education system, whether primary, secondary, or tertiary education. There's still coloniality, even though we're not formally colonized anymore.
One thing that interests me, or sort of is an enigma for me when it comes to Easterners, our approach to education and knowing about our history. When I read books like, for example, by Dr. Farid Alatas, What Your Teacher Didn't Tell You, which is a fantastic book. I recommend every Malaysian to read this. Everybody should read it. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. We come from a history and a tradition of rich culture and events and practices, religion, philosophies, and all that. Even though that we are no longer colonized, why do you think we still hang on to these teachings their way as opposed to re-embrace our lost past?
Yeah, so again, if you look at the colonial period, our education system was such that we had been cut off from our own intellectual traditions. Whether you understand that those traditions to be in religious terms or civilizational terms. So for Malaysians, our intellectual traditions are varied. We have the Islamic tradition, we have the Malay tradition, we have Hindu, Indian, South Asian traditions, Chinese, and so on. And we are largely cut off from all these traditions in our education. I think it's very important to give an example of that when we talk about being Eurocentric. Otherwise, it seems to be something very abstract, but it is something very real. A favorite example of mine, in 1492, there was an important event, what is known as the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
Right? Now, this very phrase, the discovery of America, is loaded with coloniality and with Eurocentric ideals and biases. When you say the discovery of America, the impression is that this was humanity's discovery of a hitherto unknown land. It's as if it's a universal thing, a universal discovery. The fact is, it's a European discovery. It's Europe's experience. It's a discovery for them. it's very arrogant to speak of the discovery of America when there were already people living there, right? Plus, it is also very likely that Africans already knew about America before the Europeans did. So the problem with Eurocentrism, it's a way of universalizing a specifically European experience and taken by the whole world to be their experience as well.
Yeah.
Now, another example is Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, right?
Yeah.
Now, even in Malaysia and in most of the world, people celebrate they commemorate that act in 2019 to 2021. Magellan set out in 1519 and arrived in the Philippines in 1521. We continue every year or every 100 years actually to commemorate that as if it's a great feat. Now it is a great feat, but at the same time, from the point of view of Asians and Africans, it was you could say a catastrophe or a disaster. Why? Because from the time that Columbus discovered America in 14, even I said discovery of America, right?
Yes, you did, yeah.
It shows how much it is entrenched in us. Yeah. From the time Columbus found America for the Europeans in 1492 and Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe ending in 1521, in that 30-year period, that is when the Europeans know of the whole world, preparing the way for further colonization.
Yes.
So it's nothing for us to celebrate. And the killing of Magellan in the what was later called the Philippines by Lapu-Lapu, the ruler of Mactan in the Philippines.
Okay.
No one even knows his name, Lapu-Lapu. You ask any Malaysian, they probably hadn't heard of Lapu-Lapu. When this was maybe one of the first anti-colonial movements, anti-colonial actions, in the Malay world. But we celebrate Magellan, but not Lapu-Lapu. So this is what I mean by Eurocentrism.
But when you talk about Eurocentrism, it's interesting because when we compare ourselves as a country, say to Indonesia, from my visits there, there have of course been a few, when I look at their people and I see what they discuss, because I've also hosted Indonesian professors on this podcast as well, they seem to have a very different outlook on their past. They have a love affair with their past. I tell you one story. When I went to Yogyakarta, and I was watching the famous Ramayana play, which takes place, against the backdrop of the very iconic Prambanan temples. And I saw this group of Muslim students coming, young kids watching, probably in their primary, and all their tweens and all, watching this. And I looked at my tour guide and I said, this would never happen in Malaysia. And he replied and he told me, yeah, unlike you guys, we know the difference between our religion and history. And if you look at Indonesian culture, it's rich in their own practices, their own mythology, their own culture. Why is it they can do that and they can appreciate their culture, their history, while we cannot? Does it? And I'm just one more thing. Does it have to do anything with the fact that they were colonized by the Dutch and we the British?
Well, it's not so much that they were colonized by the Dutch. That's not really the distinction, I think. It is more that they revolted against the Dutch. They revolted against their colonial power. They had a revolution. Now, when you have a revolution, you are making a clean break with the colonial past, and you are more conscious about your own heritage, your own traditions, whether political, economic, or cultural, or intellectual. So I think it reflects the degree to which they are more rooted in their traditions, because they made a conscious effort to reject coloniality, to reject not only colonial rule, they made an effort to reject it violently, because there was a revolution, there was military action. At the same time, they also rejected colonial ideas. They became more aware of the need to return to their own, the various intellectual traditions. So I think this rootedness in their own intellectual traditions makes them more secure about themselves.
As opposed to us, we're not.
As opposed to us.
Okay.
Yeah. We are still very Eurocentric. There's been a great degree of continuity between the colonial period and post-colonial period in terms of our ideas, especially the ideas held by the elite, the Malay elite, without us realizing it, that there is that continuity.
Yeah.
So overall, I think we tend to be less critical of Eurocentric ideas. we are conscious of being dominated by Eurocentric ideas, by European ideas or Western ideas. We're less. I think we're not very aware of the distinction between European ideas and Eurocentric ideas. There's an important distinction.
Which is?
Well, European ideas refers to ideas based on European experiences. It has to do with European knowledge, a lot of which is relevant and important for us, as opposed to those ideas that are based on biases and stereotypes, European biases and European stereotypes. So when Europeans talk about, in the 19th century, when they talked about the hierarchy of races, whites at the top, and then you have in a hierarchy. This refers to European bias and stereotypes. It refers, it's basically scientific racism.
I think your father wrote a book about that, right? The myth of the lazy native.
The myth of the lazy native was about how that bias was reflected in the way, in the image that Europeans had about natives. So we tend to be very much dominated by, in our school system, in tertiary education, we're still very much dominated by European ideas. We're aware of that. We're not able to deal with it because we have a sense of the superiority of Western ideas. I think that's the crux of it. My father wrote on the captive mind. We are captive minds.
Okay.
And I think because we didn't make that revolutionary break with colonial rule, we continue to be dominated by Western ideas.
I mean, interesting, because I like that term as well. When you talked about it, I think I watched a clip of you at a discussing a few books, and you used that term, the captive mind. If we are still suffering from this syndrome, how do we revolutionize in our own minds to come out of this captivity?
Well, first of all, there are many Malaysian scholars, writers, authors, activists who are conscious of the problem. The task really is to get this translated into new curriculum in our schools and universities. And that requires a change in the way our Ministry of Education thinks about education. It requires a change in the way the leaders of the universities think. And I'm sure, when we talk to the policymakers, when we talk to administrators, they would understand the problem. But changing the system is a bit difficult because we're really entrenched in a global neoliberal system of education, where now your ability to attract students, international students, it's very important to attract international students. Our ability to do that depends on our ranking. And our ranking depends on the how we fit into the global research system. It means publishing in English, basically. It means publishing in ranked journals, most of which are published in America or Britain. So we need, therefore, to publish on issues and topics that are of interest to those journals. So we're sort of, pulled in that direction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's get to the topic of today, which is, of course, we're of course talking about Malaysia and, of course, multiculturalism here. Now, before this, just to lend some context to this, just to share some definitions for you guys, and we can see whether are we on the right path or have we used the right definition for us. So Google defines multiculturalism as a policy that supports the right of different cultural and ethnic groups to maintain their cultural identities while ensuring that they have equitable access to society. Another definition is that it is the practice of giving equal importance to all cultures in society and the coexistence of multiple cultures in a single community. Britannica defines multiculturalism as the view that cultures, races, ethnicities, particularly those of minority groups, deserve special acknowledgement of their differences within a dominant political culture. And last but not least, the Collins Dictionary says that multiculturalism is a situation in which all different cultural or racial groups in a society have equal rights and opportunities, and none is ignored or regarded as unimportant. So when I see this, dare I say that none of these definitions seem to fit our country. So in your opinion, Prof, how do you define multiculturalism?
Okay, I basically agree with the definition, these various definitions. Now, of course, these definitions refer to ideal situations. I think when we look at Malaysia, in terms of policies, in terms of practice, we are not doing too bad as far as multiculturalism is concerned. I mean, for example, you look at the major races in Malaysia, they all, and including the minor, the minor ethnic groups, they all have, for the most part, I say for the most part, the opportunity, the ability to develop their culture, their language, their literature, and in various aspects. They can do this. You're not, in other countries, in some other countries of the world, a certain ethnic group would be banned from having newspapers in their language, or from having TV stations or radio stations, or having activities, public activities. So you don't have these kinds of restrictions in Malaysia. There are restrictions, but I think basically various ethnic groups and linguistic groups are able to promote and develop their interests. Now, for me, the greater problem is multiculturalism as an attitude or worldview. You see, what you were what the definitions you are reading referred to practices and policies. Yeah. Now, my problem is that for Malaysia, given that basically each ethnic group, each linguistic group, and even each religious group has the chance to develop themselves, to promote their views and their practices, especially within their own communities. Given that that is the case, Malaysians generally do not have a multicultural attitude. So I'm defining multiculturalism at that level as well. It's not just policies. The policies might be very good, but what is problematic is if people don't have a multicultural sensibility. So multiculturalism at the level of people's views, thoughts, awareness. If that is lacking, then your policies may be very good, but people are still not going to, are going to have the appreciation, the knowledge, the interest in the culture of the other. That is a problem in Malaysia.
That is definitely,
right?
I agree with you.
People live in cultural silos.
Yes.
Muslims know very little about Buddhism. They know very little about Hinduism. And many Muslims have derogatory views about other religions. The same thing goes for Hindus and Buddhists and Christians, who generally, I would say, have derogatory or condescending views about Islam. And I think a lot of this is because we do not know about the culture and the religious traditions of the other, because we're not educated in these other traditions. I don't think we have adequate education in our schools, and in public discourse also there's little education.
Definitely.
We only know we know the other at a very superficial level, right? How many non-Chinese really understand what the various Chinese festivals are about? Yeah, we know at a superficial level. How many Muslims understand what Deepavali is about?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, on that point, and again, I apologize to any Muslim listeners if I'm getting this wrong, but there's a line in the Quran that says, "Oh, humanity, indeed, we created you from male and a female and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another." This is a very powerful line because it tells that I made you in different forms so that you may know one another. So if in the Quran it's already written, why do you think that Muslims, for example, are fearful of knowing another religion? Because in my experience, and it could be different from yours, Prof, is that I have seen people online, celebrities, or very few of them have the courage to quote, for example, like I've seen people like the late, great, what's her name? Yasmin Ahmad, who said that she's inspired by the I Ching, stuff like that. Why do you think Muslims are fearful of another's knowledge?
Well, I suppose part of the reason is that they're not in touch with their own intellectual tradition. I mean, if they were, they would know that the early Muslims, the Muslim philosophers, scholars in the 9th century, in the 10th century, were inspired to a great extent by Greek philosophy. particularly by Aristotle, by Plato, by Plotinus, and so on. And I think early Muslim civilization was inspired by so many cultural, by so many civilizational products of the Greeks, the Persians, the Indians, and there was so much, imbibing from these different civilizations. So when you know that, I think then then you would be more confident. But it also goes for the others, not just for the Muslims, right?
Yeah.
So to me, the issue is that when our kids grow up at a young age, they don't learn about how basically all the civilizations, let's say we take the Muslim, Islamic civilization, Hindu civilization, Chinese civilization, all had profound influences on the development of the modern world. I mean, the science of the sciences of the Chinese. I'm talking about the pre-modern Chinese, the sciences of the pre-modern Hindus, their developments in mathematics, in the development of the zero, and so on and so forth. And then you have the development of the sciences of mathematics, of algebra, of chemistry, and many other fields among the Muslims. All of these were not only important in and of themselves, but they had an impact on the development of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, the Renaissance, and later on the Industrial Revolution and the modern world. Now, if our kids knew about not just about the West, but they also knew about how each other's civilizations, had contributed greatly to humankind, then I think they would grow up having more than just tolerance. Because what we have in this country is tolerance towards each other. But we need more than tolerance. Yeah. They would grow up having admiration and interest, and maybe later on even a great deal of love or intimacy for the other.
In your opinion, Professor, what do you think stands in the way of achieving that multiculturalism that you speak about in terms of an attitude of each Malaysian? What stands in the way of that?
I think both education and discipline.
Discipline.
When I say education, I mean the way we teach geography, history, social studies, even the sciences can be taught in a multicultural way. For example, when you teach mathematics at a young age, you can explain how the modern discipline of mathematics has been contributed to by the Chinese, by the Indians, by the Muslims. And you can do that for every subject. Yeah. You can do the same for history, geography, and so on. So education is important, and that must start from a young age. Discipline, I think, when it comes to our religious leaders and our political leaders or political elite, and all other elite, cultural elite, need to if they don't have that multicultural sensibility, they at least need to hold back in terms of how they talk about the other, and think before they speak. Think about whether what they want to say is a result of their emotions, or is it something that reflects reality? Yeah?
I think there's a very interesting clip of you online where you are very passionately, sort of, I wouldn't say condemning, but checking what, as you said, you don't think even these ulamas believe what they even say, which is quite interesting. You guys can check it out. Now, I want to get into this because in Malaysia, the problem to me, as a from what I see, please share your thoughts on this, is that multiculturalism doesn't seem to be the way that you said, which I completely agree, and that's what I would hope for as a Malaysian, to exist because of politics. It seems that multiculturalism does not profit a politician. That we need to be, this whole divide and conquer, again, in my opinion, is the sort of legacy of the British, right? So, I mean, if you see in the past, you see like, for example, like you see people like Ibrahim Ali from the past, with Perkasa holding the keris and saying he'll defend the Malay rights. Ironically, using the keris, although the keris actually has a very, very rich tradition of exactly what you said, where it started, it sort of morphed with different religious influences into our country, which is so ironic that they use that. You look at now people like Dr. Akmal Saleh, championing Malay rights in a very militant, almost fashion. If we cannot rely on the politicians or the ruling elite to develop this multicultural society, who then does this burden fall upon to create the world that you have spoken about?
Well, first of all, as far as the elite are concerned, the political elite, the religious elite, we have to keep on pushing them, urging them, reminding them that we can't stop, right? At the same time, we have to realize that we can't solely rely on them. And I think the onus falls on the cultural elite, the intellectuals, the artists, and activists. We need to work independently to develop this multicultural sensibility through, of course, education outside of the universities, outside of the schools, to the extent that our activities can have an influence on people in various ways, not just in a formal sense through seminars and talks and conferences, but also through other forms of cultural production, through the making of movies, of film, of series, the writing of children's books, and so on and so forth. So we need, I think, an active intellectual movement that's dedicated towards developing multiculturalism.
It's interesting you say that, Rob, because to me, I've always felt a little bit that I feel that people such as from your group, the intellectuals that you all are, have let us down in a way that perhaps you all did not contribute to realigning the entire narrative that we have built in this country. Do you think that academics such as yourself, I mean, you are on this podcast, so well done, you're doing an amazing job, but other academics should take a more active role in participating in the realignment of the way we think?
Yes, I agree. See, I mentioned the need for an intellectual movement.
Yeah.
What that means is, it doesn't mean you can't have an intellectual movement with just a handful of academics, doing these things. An intellectual movement means that you have a critical mass of people. You have various groups among intellectuals. When I say intellectuals, I don't necessarily mean academics. They could be intellectuals outside of the universities. But these are thinking people who think beyond the confines of their narrow disciplines. We're thinking of the good of the greater good of society. They need to come together and to be involved in various programs. And that's the problem. We don't have such an intellectual movement. So I agree with you.
I think your father was probably the last one who took part in politics. He was a thinker who took part, right? I don't see any other intellectual like that today. There's no one.
Well, I think there are individuals here and there, but it's not a movement. It's not a concerted effort by people coming together, developing a program for the long term, and then working on it. And that is what we lack.
In a speech that you gave, you talked about the difference, the way Malaysia was perceived. Back in the 80s, when you were a student, you said that when you went abroad, Malaysia was a model of how you could be conservative as well as have a marriage in conservatism and a development. Today, it's a model for what happens when you mix politics and religion. Why do you think this shift happened?
Well, I think what I had said earlier on was that Malaysia was a model of how one could be traditional, and hold on to tradition, at the same time, navigate our way towards modernity. And it was seen by some Muslim countries as a way to go in terms of how to be Muslim, at the same time to modernize. Yeah, and this wasn't true in the 80s. I think, and we've moved away from that.
Definitely.
We're seen to be more extremist in some of our practices, not in the violent sense, but in the sense of our, let's say, a decrease in our multicultural sensibility. And that is seen, in terms of various, it's reflected by various events in the past. where you had, the cow head incident in a temple, and then you had the same thing happen in a mosque.
The pig head.
Thrown a pig head. Yeah. You've also had intra-Muslim sectarianism, anti-Shiite discourse and hate speech even. And I really think that this certain quarters gain political mileage from this. And why do they choose to get into sectarianism, for example, or to play the religious card? It's because they are unable to or prefer not to deal with other pressing problems. If, for example, if we successfully dealt with the problem of the B40, we improved income levels and economic opportunities, then we don't have to play around with religion. What I mean is, if the ruling government, if the government of the day was able to deal with these economic problems successfully, that is their justification for being in power and remaining in power. Not necessary to play any other card, any ethnic card or religious card. Now, I don't really quite understand why we don't do that. And maybe it's just easier to play the religious or the ethnic card.
Definitely. Yeah. It grabs the imagination of the voter immediately. Now, one thing that we have to accept that in Malaysia, the Malays have the advantage, especially thanks to things like the NEP, thanks to, the whole social contract and so on and so forth. So one could argue then that the direction of this country is pretty much decided by them. As a voter base, they are the largest voter bank in the country and all that. Do you think that the Malay community has done a good enough job to actually direct this country to a better future in terms of multiculturalism?
First of all, I think I must say that many people think that if we promote multiculturalism, it means putting the Malays at the same level as the other ethnic groups, right? And they will lose control of the country. Yeah. Now, I don't think that is true. People must understand that promoting multiculturalism does not mean that you are marginalizing the Malays or giving them a lower status. As you said, they are the majority. They will always be the majority, and by sheer numbers, they will always control the government. This is what I believe, and I think many people believe this. If that being the case, the dominant culture of the country will always be Malay. It will always be a dominant culture, just as the dominant culture in Thailand is Thai, and the dominant culture in the United States is sort of, you can say, Anglo-Saxon. So that will be the case in Malaysia. Now, granting other groups the right to develop their culture, to promote their culture, and making it possible for the dominant majority, the Malays, to learn more about these other cultures, in no way threatens the shall we say, the dominance of the Malays, and the Malays will feel that as long as they do not feel insecure. They will feel insecure if they continue to be told that they, have basic incapacities. This is a throwback from the colonial period. The British said that the Malays have basic incapacities, such as laziness. And some of the Malay elite, after independence, continue to say that, right? Creating that sense of insecurity. When a Malay leader says that the Malays are in danger of losing the country, this is very dangerous talk. It's first of all not true, and secondly, you are deepening that sense of insecurity, and then you make the Malays, some of the Malays, they are made to feel vulnerable, and when they hear multiculturalism, when they hear pluralism, they say, "Oh, this is very bad for us. We will, we'll lose our country." Yeah. So we need to play this. We need to really conscientize people about what is really the case.
I want to just take it off a tangent in a bit. Another person who I'm a big fan of is your cousin, I assume, Syed Ali Taufik Alatas. I love his videos, by the way, and love listening to him. Now, he said this quote, and I just want to get your view on it because I myself would like to know. It's interesting. You know this. He said, in this country, we have systemic racism, which is far against the teaching of Islam. Now, why I bring this question is because in this podcast, I want to promote the ideology that Islam isn't the religion that people say it is, right? The extremism, the fundamentalism, and all this nonsense, right? It is there is a different side to it that I think people should appreciate. So, from your perspective, what does he mean when he says that systemic racism is far apart from the teaching of Islam? What are those teachings that make it so far apart?
Well, of course, I agree with Ali's statement. Now, when we say that Islam is far from racism, what it means is that both religious Islamic teachings and scriptures, as well as the practice of Muslims historically, has been to avoid racism, to proclaim the humanity of mankind. The verse of the Quran that you cited just now about how humans were created in order to know one another. That is an example. That is the basis for multiculturalism. In the Sufi tradition of the Muslims, a famous Sufi once said that the quality of chivalry means, an example of chivalry is when a man makes no difference between a believer and an unbeliever at his dinner table.
Oh, wow.
See? And then we can find many examples of the early Muslims, including, of course, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said that Muslims were obliged to protect Christians or to protect the place of worship of Christians. We have so many examples of that. You had non-Muslims who were had very high positions in the administration of some of the caliphs, of some of the caliphates, like in Andalusia, when Spain was under Arab rule. So there are numerous examples.
I think another example is Salahuddin. Whenever he took over certain areas, he would not destroy the current regime. He would just build on it. Build systems.
Yes, Salahuddin Ayyubi. That's true. Yeah. So the thing is, you see, in Islam as well as in all religious traditions, you have these lofty ideals, and you find many examples from history where these lofty ideals were put into practice. But you also have extremist orientations among people of this religion, and these were also put into practice. And people need to be made aware of that these extremist practices and ideas were aberrations or are aberrations, and are also seen to be as such. So you've got Muslim extremists who even consider other Muslims as apostates, right? You have the same thing among extremist Protestant Christians,
Hindus and all that.
What is happening in India today? You know, the Hindutva movement is an extremist movement. So I guess we need to. That's why multiculturalism is needed. If non-Muslims in this country knew about the history of Islam, then they would be more confident in, they would believe that whatever they see to be extremism among Muslims is an aberration, and that doesn't represent the tradition.
One thing, and this is again maybe just a sidestep for a bit, but I have noticed that in my journey as a person, I grew up liking religion, philosophy. I don't know why, I just was attracted to it from a very young age. And I found out, there's a saying from this movie I like where it says the only way to come back home is to leave, right? And the same thing I've experienced with my own religion, being a Hindu. The only way I learn more about Hinduism is to learn about somebody else's. And when I look at you and your siblings, you all are known as intellectuals in this country. Reading and and discerning is a big part of your lives, I'm sure. But just to get your thoughts on it, how do you tell someone, an individual, to go out there and explore other religions without the fear of losing their own? Because that seems to be a common fear that I see with people. How do you communicate that to someone and make them practice that? Because that's for the betterment of the country.
Yes, that's right. Now, I think it's difficult to do for someone who's already set in their ways. So again, we go back to education from the time kids are very young. They need to grow up within that multicultural atmosphere. Of course, they have to be taught their own religious tradition. They have to be, rooted in that. I think it's important when people are educated in their religion, whether they are, children or older, they've got to be told that there's a distinction between the specific beliefs of practices of a particular religion and the universal values that underlie it. When people understand about universal values, then they can see the similarity with others. Right? If you just stay on the specifics, then you seem very different, right? I mean, for example, Muslim practices seem to be so different from the practices of Hindus during Taipusam, right? From a Muslim point of view, the Hindu practices would be very strange.
Yeah, definitely.
Piercing of the body and all that, very, very strange. But then what are the universal values underlying the practices of Hindus during Taipusam? What are the universal values that underlie the Deepavali, that underlie Chinese New Year and so on? At the level of universal values, you will find that there are great similarities with across all the religions. Al-Biruni was a Muslim from what is now called Uzbekistan. He lived in the 10th century, and he spent more than a decade in India studying Indian religions, and he wrote about it. It's a book, a massive volume called the Book of India, the book of what constitutes India. It's basically about Indian religions. He was talking about what would later on be called Hinduism, and he had great admiration for the Hindus. And he even said in his introduction that I'm writing this book to dispel certain myths that Muslims have about Indian religions. He made a distinction between the folk practices of Hindus, which seem very strange and odd to Muslims. That was to be distinguished from the high philosophy and theology of the Hindus, which he saw, there were great similarities with Islam. Oh. So he was able to really appreciate the beliefs of the Hindus. So imagine if Al-Biruni was taught to our children, Yeah.
That brings another interesting question, because you talk about starting from a young age, multiculturalism starting from a young age. But I've always believed, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, that religion should not be taught to the young, because religion is too complex a subject. There's a lot of allegory, there's a lot of metaphors, amidst facts and all this. Do you, especially, of course, philosophy and all that, should it be taught at a later date in your life, maybe in your teens, so that you have the ability to analyze and then make the comparisons that you have just mentioned? Because as a child, you would never be able to do that.
Well, okay, when you say religion should not be taught as a child, you're referring maybe to the school, in the school system.
School system,
Of course, at home, parents will make sure that their children are introduced to their respective religions, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think at the school level, it's good to teach religion, but not in a doctrinal way. So it's not so much that we are teaching religious dogma to the students.
Definitely.
It's more, I think, in terms of the history of religious traditions. Religion may be understood in a more broader sense, in a civilizational sense. So when we talk about the history of, when we talk about Hinduism or about Islam, it's important for our kids, even at a young age, to know about how the Hindus and the Muslims were involved in the development of various kinds of technology, like the history of the zero, right? It's something that is rooted in religion, actually. The idea of zero.
Okay.
Or what about the handmade carpet?
Okay.
The Persian, Turkish, Kashmiri carpets, right? It's not just a cultural artifact; it's rooted in religion, in a sense, for example, that the geometric designs reflect infinity, reflect the systematic nature of the universe. And that's why you have these designs.
Oh, really?
Cupboards. Yes.
I did not know that.
Right. So I'm not saying that religion should be taught in terms of teaching the dogma, to our children, but to teach the civilization of these religions.
When I look at the statistics recently, there's a few surveys that were being done in Malaysia. And interestingly enough, there was one survey being done on a group of Malaysians, basically getting their viewpoint on multiculturalism. And funnily enough, the states that were in the center and eastern part of Peninsula recorded the highest rate of people actually, including Muslims, who sided with multiculturalism. That they said that while we are an Islamic state, we still have to have respect and learn about other religions and all that kind of stuff, live in a way. But perhaps not so surprising, the northern states and the states on the eastern part of Peninsula recorded complete opposite findings. They wanted Islam to still be the main, and they felt that multiculturalism should not be focused on. Yeah. And then you hear people like Tun Mahathir saying that multiculturalism is going against our federal constitution. You hear all these type of things, right? Yeah. When I hear you speak, it's sort of I'm just thinking that freedom of thought and freedom to study must be there. That perhaps, and I could be wrong, and I want to get your opinion on this, perhaps could it be that multiculturalism in those states that are more conservative do not exist because of the Muslim clerics who may say things that sort of stoke the fears of the people and make them feel that they're under threat when there is no threat whatsoever? Are they to be blamed as well?
Well, I think that may happen to some extent, but I think the larger problem is the greater sense of insecurity, because those are also the poorer states.
Yeah.
And there is a sense of economic security that's greater there than in other parts of Malaysia, which are more urbanized and where standards of living are higher. Again, when the religious leaders fail to be more progressive and play on religious sentiments rather than deal with the various material problems that you have in these areas, material problems to do with economic development, to do with infrastructure. Now you have this problem of flooding, for example, in the north. Year after year, you have the problem of flooding. Rather than deal with those problems and solve those problems, if you do solve those problems, there won't be this insecurity anymore. Yeah. But as you yourself said, it's easier to deal with the religious insecurities, definitely. To play the religious card rather than to deal with the actual material problems.
No, I mean, I would love to. I think for all Malaysians to practice that sort of learning and trying to discover other religions. I think it creates a much better situation all around. But I have heard past politicians, prime ministers even, who have gone on television live, big news channels and said this. They have always said that they are Malay first before they are Malaysian, right? When I hear these kind of statements, it worries me. Now, in your opinion, should it be that they are Malaysian, Malay, or Muslim first? Which should be the first in order for us to be closer to achieving this multiculturalism?
You see, this is a matter of words, okay? I think if you are Malay first and then Malaysian second, if you are truly Malay, then you would be truly multicultural.
Because the Malay race is a multicultural.
It's a multicultural race. It's a very open race for centuries. Had been open to intermarriage, to cultural influences in music, in cuisine, in so many areas of life. And I think I would say the same for any race or ethnic group or civilization or any religious tradition. If you were truly Hindu, you would be multicultural. If you were truly Muslim, you would be multicultural. If you're truly Malay, Chinese, the Chinese civilization is a very, it's steeped in universal values. Of course, every tradition expresses itself in specific ways, but underlying it are the universal values. If you're truly steeped in Chinese tradition, it is then that you would really understand and value another tradition. Al-Biruni was truly steeped in Islamic tradition. And it's because of that he could understand those values and ideas of the Hindus. He could appreciate them because he appreciates good ideas. He appreciates progressive ideas. So to be Malay first, it means that you would be Malaysian first if you are really Malay.
Yeah, definitely. Because they have influences from Indonesia, Siam, and all this different huge thing. Now, one of the things that again I've been, when I was doing my research on this, I always go back to that. This problem of multiculturalism seems to stem from thought. It's our mind. It's in our mind. It's not real. It's not tangible. It's our own restrictions that we put on. If we look at the current education system, and you have touched on this previously, talk about education and all that, you see the sort of technology now getting more involved in education, right? You talk about AI, ChatGPT, and all this kind of stuff. The problem with this situation is that it is creating a potentially a generation that will become more and more dependent. And that will ultimately result in people not being able to think. People like you, sir, who you are thinkers, right? And you are the people who are responsible to move the world forward. Do you think that with the current coming of technology in more and more into our daily lives, that multiculturalism would not be achieved because of the dying of thought, the dying of thinking?
All right. This is a very interesting question that I've not really thought about. The technology that we have now, AI, ChatGPT, and so on, this makes it easier. It facilitates people being less creative. That's definitely true. But it doesn't mean that people were more creative before. In even 100 years ago, without all these technologies, 50 years ago, without these technologies, people still strive to be uncreative through plagiarism, for example. Plagiarism is a big problem, has been for decades in our universities.
Yes.
Technology allows us to catch plagiarism. You have this software called Turnitin.
Yes,
right?
I used to use.
But now there's a new problem because you have AI. So now they have to devise new methods to catch these things. So I think you will always have this problems of imitation, of lack of creativity, regardless of the level of technology. So I think at the same time, we hope that there will be a group of intellectuals and scholars and activists in all areas of life who remain unaffected by this. And I think there's always such a group. There's always such a group. Regardless of what happens to the majority. We may control imitation, we may control plagiarism through rules and regulations and through punishment. And I think we will always be successful to some extent, but probably to a great extent. That doesn't mean that people are going to become more creative. Imagine if you got rid of AI. You forbid students from using AI, okay? It doesn't mean they're going to be more creative. They're going to be more thoughtful. You can still be an uncreative mind, a captive mind, a mediocre mind without the aid of technology. Technology maybe enhances your mediocrity.
That's a very good line, sir. I'm using that. Wow.
Copyright though.
I've never heard that line before. Technology, I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
That's true, yeah.
So you need to do more than control technology. You need to actually develop a sense of love, of passion for ideas, right? To spark the creative spirit in people. It's not going to work for everyone, but you need to create that atmosphere where people can be creative because they're simply in love with ideas. It means allowing people to be free to think. It means allowing our universities, the students and the lecturers to be free. It means, for example, getting rid of clocking in. Right now in our universities, lecturers have to clock in. One has to get rid of that because university lecturers are not factory workers. Factory workers clock in. And there's a basic mistrust of factory workers. That's why they have to have this clocking in system. Now, and I don't think it's nice to do that to factory workers themselves, right? But let alone for university lecturers. We must not treat universities as we treat factories or as we treat a corporate office. It should not be important whether lecturers are on campus or not, as long as they produce, as long as they are available to their students, as long as they are available to their advisees, as long as they come to class on time and teach properly, as long as they publish, as long as these are fulfilled. Don't treat them as untrusted workers. And don't have rules and regulations which tell university lecturers that they're not supposed to criticize the government. This, I think, is counter.
Yeah, which is why I think a lot of professors don't take part in the political discussion. Only a few. Yeah, I think that's why.
Yeah, they are away. They are afraid of repercussions. Students also. In fact, I have to give credit to our students in the universities who think differently and who are more creative and want to organize events, but they are often prevented or not given permission or not given approval by university authorities. So that really has to change, so that creativity in general can improve, not only where multiculturalism is concerned, but where everything is concerned.
When I was a young, I guess when I was a college student, I think that's when my interest in other religions just really peaked at that point. And that sort of paved a lot of reading. It started off with Christianity, then I moved to Buddhism, and then Islam. I've not gone to the Torah and all that yet. One thing about Islam, especially in my experience with it, is that this was post 9/11. Right, and back then Islam was packaged as a religion of extremism, and that's all it did. When I started reading about it, then I discovered that the greater jihad is within yourself, not with it. And all this kind of concept. It's really, whoa, I didn't know this. And then when I meet people like you all, and when I see you speak, see your family speaks, and all that, I just wonder. Because for me, when I look at what's happening in India, as a Hindu, I feel we've gone pretty far from what we are supposed to be. Do you feel that feeling when you see how Islam is practiced in Malaysia?
I sort of go back and forth between that feeling and a more optimistic feeling.
Okay.
Yeah. When I hear certain leaders say, certain things, I feel very discouraged. When I meet students, and I know a lot of students in Malaysia, or I see young people. When I go to events organized by indie presses, indie publishers, I feel more, optimistic, because I see that those ideas haven't trickled down to these people. Yeah, so it's a back and forth thing. So certainly, I think the more exclusivist, close-minded ideas have become entrenched within certain groups, and when a person, when members of some of these groups have a position of authority, whether a politician or a religious leader, then their views have some traction. For example, it has frequently been said by certain religious leaders that Muslims may not greet non-Muslims on the occasion of their festivals, or Muslims may not greet salamu alaikum to non-Muslims. I find this very difficult to understand, because the essence of Islam is that it's a religion of peace. Salam means peace for humanity, not just for people who embrace Islam. And Islam is said to be, a blessing for humanity, not just for Muslims. So I don't understand when it is said that we do not or should not wish peace for non-Muslims. How can that be? And also, it's rather ridiculous, because if we cannot wish peace for non-Muslims in Malaysia, if there's no peace among non-Muslims in Malaysia, there will also be no peace for us, for Muslims, right? Yeah. So it's also illogical. But you find many, many Muslims who don't accept these ideas, who don't accept these inclusivist ideas.
Yeah.
So I would have to say I feel there is hope.
There is
that,
hope.
that that we, those of us on the ground are sort of pushing back against these exclusivist ideas.
We talked about what you felt needed to be done in terms of education and starting from young and sort of to promote multiculturalism in Malaysia, to target the young, definitely, right? To create a new generation of Malaysians. But what about the self? What do we as individuals need to do? Because I always in this podcast, we always talk about government and others, but I rarely talk about the self. What do we need to do as a people to help push this further, to ensure that multiculturalism becomes true?
Okay, when you say self, I think maybe you are referring to not just the lone individual, but the individual as part of a larger community, as part of a family. And
no, I mean me. Like for example, like for me, what I did was I read a lot. Right, I read a lot, and that reading and that sort of removed all the fear that I had. Whatever I just is learning.
Yeah.
Do we need to do more? I mean, what do we need to do?
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I think for individuals, depending on where they are and what they're doing in life, there are many things they can do. But I think for reasonably intelligent, educated individuals, what you said, reading is very important. But beyond that, get out there, attend talks and seminars. I see, for example, some of the indie publishers, they organize talks on various topics, and most of the attendees are non-academics. They are, should I say, lay people, right? Some are students, some are young people who have finished their studies, they're working, but they're just interested. I meet so many of Malaysians at these talks, at these presentations, who are not studying or finished their studies, but they come for these things simply because they're interested in the ideas. And I think more Malaysians need to do this, to become sort of educated, well-read, interested lay people. Reading books is not just for academics. The standard of our universities is such that I think we need to bring intellectual discourse outside of the universities. Yeah.
Now, in my conversation with Mastura, your sister, we touched about this a bit about this sort of, especially your late father and how his viewpoint on and how his practices were always sort of skewed towards multiculturalism, basically the way he selected staff and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
Now, to me, and I think a lot of people out there, when I look at also surveys that are being done about the Malaysian people, the statistics, the data points to that the people generally want multiculturalism. Generally, I think we need to paint that picture, because I don't want to paint the picture that Malaysians are we want to fight each other. No. Based on stats, it's right there. It's online. You can check it out. What is your message to the politicians out there today, and what would be your thoughts about them when it comes to the topic of multiculturalism? Are they stopping it?
Well, I guess maybe I would say two or three things.
Please.
One is that be clear that multiculturalism is not a threat to the dominance of Malay culture and the position of the Malays in this country. It does not oppose the constitution. I don't believe that. And if to the extent that the Malays consider themselves to be in charge of the country, then they can afford to be magnanimous in allowing this multiculturalist spirit to develop throughout the country. So that's one point. I think the second point is that listen to the Malay ground. I think the lesser educated Malay, the taxi driver, working class Malays, don't feel that cultural threat. I remember, I've spoken to many taxi drivers, I would ask them about, for example, when we pass a church, I asked them, what do you feel about the church, showing its cross, and they don't even understand my question. They said, what, nothing wrong with that. We are, we are a country of many races, nothing wrong, But then you would get a politician or religious elite who will say, this this cross is problematic. We should not allow.
Yes, I can see it from my balcony.
Yeah, and it hurts the feelings of Muslims, right? Yeah. So, and then when you hear that, you may get the impression that this is what the Malay ground thinks, but we should listen to the Malay ground. I think they're a lot more open than we give them credit for.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Interesting you bring up the topic of the cross, because if you go to Saudi Arabia, for example, Jesus, or in his representation in Islam, you can find him in mosques. When I went to Australia and I went to an Orthodox Christian Egyptian church, I was surprised to see Jesus there holding a book with Arabic writing, and I was telling my friends that this would never happen in Malaysia. This just cannot happen. I'm always surprised that, because why is there this divide between the way Islam is practiced outside of Malaysia and here? What's the reason for the divide?
Again, I think it has to do with the politics of insecurity. For example, Christians in the Arab world use Allah. To refer to God, right? And that's never been an issue among the Muslims. It is an issue here. It's often presented in religious terms, but I don't think it's a religious issue. I think it's an issue of the politics of insecurity.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So it goes back to that at the end.
It goes back to that. Yeah.
What is and just to sum this up, what is the best way to remedy this insecurity?
My answer would be actually part of the previous question about what I would say to the elite. Yeah. So I guess my third point would be that try to deal with the material problems of our country, and there are many material problems. Economic poverty, social problems. We have a lot of social problems in the country, and ecological issues. Right now, we're experiencing, the issue of floods
and all that. Yeah.
And a lot of this is man-made. It's not just acts of God, as it were. So I think we need to more successfully deal with our material problems, so that there's a greater sense, experience and sense of prosperity, and then these other problems will go away, and there's no need. There will be no currency, with religious. It will not have the effect if you play up on religious sentiments. Definitely. If there's greater prosperity. So we really need to deal with, and the fact is, we are not a country of religious strife, of interreligious conflict or ethnic conflict. We are not a country of that, because to a great extent we have done well in terms of economics, in terms of infrastructure, and we're not. Despite all the problems that we cite with regard to our political leadership, we are not a totalitarian state that severely oppresses people. And we have a decent standard of living in comparison to most of the third world. So that only proves that if we do better in the material front, then a lot of these other problems will go away.
Oh, thank you. That's very true. I never thought about that. But thank you so much, Professor, for coming on. And thank you for sharing all the insights that you have. I truly appreciate it. And I would love to have you on again, perhaps when you're back in Malaysia after you. No, you will be back, stay for a long time. So hopefully I'll get you back again. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's all for us today, folks. We've had an interesting conversation about multiculturalism, and truly enjoyed listening to Professor Syed Farid Alatas. And hopefully soon I would like to have him on again, perhaps with his siblings, and we can have a more active discussion as well, another one. So if you guys have any comments, any thoughts, please share the comments, and also please share these videos. Till next time, we'll see you.